Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey all, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is an interview with Ruth Whippman. Ruth is a journalist and the author of the new book, BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. You're want to give this a listen, whether you're raising boys or girls. It was a super interesting look at sort of the state of boys in our culture today at this really interesting time where we are raising up girls in a way that's totally beautiful and appropriate. But what happens to the boys when this is happening? Ruth really does a wonderful job of looking at this, looking at the reasons behind it, looking at the differences in how we raise boys and girls still, even if we think we're raising them, in a non-sexist way, the way boys are treated in our culture and sort of the outcomes, the sort of scary outcomes that are happening for boys. And she did this in a way that, I'm going to use her words, she looks at how privilege and disadvantage are intertwined for boys. This is a really great read and listen, or rather a great read, and I hope you find that it's a great listen. Let's meet Ruth. Hi, Ruth. Welcome to the podcast.
It's really great to be here. Thank you.
So I just told you before we started recording that I just finished your book this morning, like an hour before we started the podcast taping, and I really loved it. So when this podcast comes out, your book will have just come out yesterday, if people are listening to this podcast on June 5th. I really encourage anyone to go out and get it, order a copy of it. It's really, really wonderful for, I think, moms and dads of girls as well as boys. But tell us the title of your book.
So my book is called BoyMom, and it is BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity.
Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So I'm a journalist and an author. I have a previous book called America the Anxious, and I write for various places. I write quite often for the New York Times, The Guardian, Huffington Post, etc. And I'm also a mom of 3 sons, hence the title Boy Mom, which I have a complicated relationship with that identity, the Boy Mom hashtag identity. But I have 3 boys who are 13, 10, and 6 now. But the book starts when my youngest son was born, which was just around the time of the Me Too movement. It was such a fraught and complicated time. It was so many conflicted feelings going on and so many complicated feelings.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully we are raising a new generation of men. You talk about how privilege and disadvantage are intertwined for boys. Yes. And that seemed to be really like a big theme of your book.
Yes.
And I just want to center us in the idea that we're going to be talking a lot about how hard life can be for boys today, but also don't want us to get lost in what you mentioned in the book and what some people call himpathy, right? Just to call out that it does exist a lot of male privilege in the world, yes. But being locked into this idea of masculinity also makes things so hard for boys.
Yes, absolutely. So what I came to realize, because I think a lot of the conversation around boys and men and gender at the moment is one about sort of power and oppression. And those dynamics are very, very real. I mean, it is true that men have had privilege through history. They have greater access to power. They're still paid more. They still control women's bodies. There's still terrible things happening to women all over the world. But the same system, I think it's easy to see that and then feel as though we're on different sides, that men have all the benefits of patriarchy and women have all the disadvantages. But actually, what I came to realize when reporting this book, and also from my own experience raising sons, is that, as I say, the privilege and disadvantage are really intertwined. The same system that harms women also harms men and boys. And the same rigid gender roles and expectations that come from patriarchy are really harmful for boys. They have to subscribe to these very rigid masculinity norms, or I guess they don't have to, but there's extreme pressure on them to conform to these very sort of, to these ideals of like being emotionally stoic, being physically tough, being mentally tough, being, squashing your emotions and feelings. And boys, and we expect those things from boys, and we kind of project these qualities onto boys. And so we tend to see them not as fully emotional beings, as caregivers and parents. And so I think there's this pattern that starts right from birth, and there's a lot of research on it, which shows that right from when they're born, people tend to sort of masculinize baby boys and see them as, when they cry, they tend to see baby boys as angry rather than sad, or they treat them more roughly. They give them less like positive attention, less nurturing, less care than they give baby girls. And there's all kinds of data on this. And this goes on all the way through childhood. We tend to see boys as, I say it in the book, we tend to see boys as bad, not sad. So if a boy is acting out, we tend to see it as a discipline problem rather than an emotional problem. And we sort of tend to code their reactions as anger and bad behavior. So they get funneled into these disciplinary systems. And this just keeps compounding and compounding and compounding. And then those are the tools they learn for how to show their emotions and then, it becomes a vicious circle.
Yeah, you talk about the research that shows that boys and girls start out with relatively similar levels of emotional intelligence and expressing feelings. And by the time they hit, I think kindergarten, you said, there's already started marked drops in their ability to express emotions and read other people's emotions.
Yes, absolutely. And, there's the Judy Chu and Niobe Way are two researchers who've done a lot of work in this area. And it's like, yes, where boys have the same innate sensitivity and empathy as girls. And if anything, they're actually more emotionally vulnerable and sensitive at birth than girls are.
Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit? I was going to ask you about that research that shows that boys are actually more fragile in a lot of ways than girls are. I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, this was something that was a real surprise to me, because when you talk about gender differences, whether things are nature or nurture, and there's so much research on this, and a lot of it is quite contradictory. But, we tend to think of this kind of boys will be boys thing as though boys are kind of innately hardwired to be destructive or aggressive or badly behaved. But actually, the main gender differences that come from, that are innately in us, that come from nature as opposed to nurture, are that boys are actually more emotionally sensitive and more emotionally vulnerable. Their brains are literally neurobiologically more fragile than girls' brains. So a male brain is born around 6 weeks less mature than a female brain at birth. Not sure exactly why, and it's in the right brain, the emotional centers, that it's less mature. So these are the sort of centers that help you form the attachment bond with the mother. They help you self-regulate emotionally. They help you calm down if you're upset. And so baby boy, and you've had kids, so you know that the difference between a brand new newborn and a 6-week-old baby is a lot. A lot of development happens in that time. And so this is the work of Alan Shaw, who's a neuroscientist and a psychoanalyst, and he looks at these sort of early differences between boys and girls, and he's written a lot about male vulnerability. And it's quite shocking, because what happens is that it then becomes this double whammy. The baby boys are more vulnerable. They actually need more care than baby girls. They need more attachment from their mother or caregiver. They need more nurturing, but they get less. And so it kind of becomes this, compounding problem where, they need more, they get less. And so they don't develop the same empathy and social skills along the way as girls do. So there's this innate vulnerability, which we then compound with all this socialization. So these sort of differences, small differences at birth, become bigger and bigger and bigger. And this pattern keeps continuing throughout childhood and throughout adulthood as well. So it is both nature and nurture. And I think this, for me, it was very helpful because, my boys were a lot and quite hard to handle when they were little, and they did have a lot of meltdowns. They did get aggressive. They were all the things that are hard to deal with as a parent. They were all of them. And I think for me, it was really helpful to see this, especially when there was this wider conversation going on around toxic masculinity. And then your 4-year-old boy is hitting his brother over the head with a, Lego spaceship, and the other one's shooting the other one with a Nerf gun. And I think once, it was very easy to see this in terms of some like terrible thing about boys and men, and as part of this whole thing about toxic masculinity. But when I started seeing it as a mother as vulnerability and sensitivity that needed care and attention and nurture as a response rather than more discipline and harshness and, that sort of thing. I think it really helped me. It helped me to bond with them and to connect with them. It helped me to and it helped them as well. It definitely helped them to self-regulate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that was really interesting reading your book through the lens of being a parenting coach is you write a lot about in the first, half of the book about how challenging you found being a mother and that your kids were really challenging. And you spend a lot of time comparing the challenges you were having to the challenges you didn't see other people having. And as a parenting coach, I'm reading it going, she's not having a typical experience. Like there's something going on with her kids. Like her kids are in the 10% of the kids who are more challenging. And then lo and behold, you end up getting an assessment for your kids and finding out that all three of them are neurodivergent. And my parenting coach self was like, aha, I knew it.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I think we were handed a really challenging situation, I think. And this was the difficult thing because, all the narratives about boys, which we've all heard, boys will be boys and boys are, oh, that's just what boys are like. And they love breaking everything. And they love, they're all of these sort of boy stories, and our boys were all of these things, but it's really hard to separate that out from, what's pathologizing normal boyhood and what is neurodivergence. And, so throughout the book, that's a sort of running theme. And then we do go and get them assessed.
Let's just talk a little bit about, boys are more fragile. Environmental stressors affect them more greatly than they do girls. Then they get less nurturing, more labeling as behavioral rather than having a hard time. And so where does that leave us today? You talk about the crisis that boys are facing today. I know you talked about in schools and just in terms of their mental health statistics. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think boys are in real trouble at the moment. I mean, I think, and also the statistics, the sort of ways that we have for understanding adolescent mental health don't really map well to boys. Because if you think about it, the way they gather these statistics, so they talk to, they call up teenagers or they survey teenagers and they say, are you depressed? Are you lonely? Are you anxious? Are you this? And I think asking that question of a teenage girl and a teenage boy is going to be a really different experience because the boys are socialized not to admit it, that to admit to depression and anxiety and loneliness is a weakness. And so they'll just say, no, I'm fine. And so I feel like, and there's a really well-known phenomenon that those statistics are not so accurate for boys, that there's a real underreporting of depression and anxiety and mental health problems amongst boys, big for exactly that reason. And it makes sense, because I interviewed many boys for this book and, we'd start off and I'd be like, how's everything going? And they'd be like, fine, everything's great. And they would have this bluster. And it would only be after interviewing them for, 1 to 2 hours that they would start to sort of reveal these deeper things. And so you can see how if a pollster calls up with a checklist of questions and says, are you depressed? Are you anxious? They're just going to say no, and it will get missed. So I think that's a big part of it. And yeah, boys at the moment adolescent boys are really kind of in crisis. They're very socially isolated compared to any previous generation. They're spending a vast amount of time on screens, much more than same age girls, and they're socializing in person much less than teenage girls are. And I think part of that is the socialization that we give them that really is not a lesson in connection and intimacy. And, for many reasons, we don't teach boys to be these kind of relational, emotional beings. And that makes it really hard to find friendships and connection in adulthood. And we're seeing that now.
I think you mentioned too that the way that the polls are conducted, it might not show up as much that boys are so depressed and lonely, but the suicide rates for boys are, what was the statistic?
Yeah, so the suicide rates for adolescent boys are nearly 4 times the rate for adolescent girls. A lot of this is that there are male mental health problems which are just getting missed in a really, really serious way. And it's part of this same phenomenon that we see these, when we talk about the adolescent, when we talk about the crisis with adolescents, we tend to talk about girls in terms of sadness and mental health problems and depression and anxiety. And when we talk about boys, the sort of wider debate in the media tends to be about, underachievement, bad behavior, antisocial behavior, substance abuse, these kinds of things. We see boys as bad, not sad. And I think that we're missing
Well, those
something.
things all probably come out of depression and anxiety and
Yes,
feeling alone.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
because we don't give boys the emotional vocabulary to express their sadness in more constructive ways, then that is how it comes out in boys. Those are the symptoms of depression in adolescent boys.
Before I backtracked on myself, I started to talk about that boys aren't doing as well in school either, not finishing school or going on to higher education in the same number as girls are.
Yeah, the statistics on that are really shocking. And the gap is widening every year. And some of that is just that, girls were held back for so long that, not given the opportunities, and now they are, and they're soaring ahead, which is obviously wonderful. We all want opportunities for girls, but they're, every year the gap gets bigger and boys are falling behind and behind and behind. And there are many reasons for this, and some of them are to do with like late maturing brains and, that sort of innate reasons, hardwired reasons. But some of them are, a huge amount of these are to do with socialization and the way that we socialize boys, the way that we talk to boys, the way that we teach them the skills that they need to succeed in the classroom about emotional self-regulation, and the way that we engage them in learning in school. There's this narrative in politics, on one side of the aisle in politics, which is just, the reason why boys are doing so badly is because of this, like they call it the feminization of the classroom. So it's this idea that, we're focusing too much on girls, and schools are great environments for girls, and boys are innately wired to be kind of, they can't sit still, they need to run around. We should teach them, we should let them sort of indulge their natural interests, which are things like weapons and war, and we shouldn't be talking to them about feelings and all this girly stuff. But actually, it's almost the opposite, that boys don't get enough engagement around emotions and relationships and social connection, and their relationships with teachers are damaged by the fact that they're seen as discipline problems. So actually, I sort of flipped in the book, I ended up sort of flipping it on its head and saying, well, actually, what we need is more feminization of the classroom. I
know what you mean. It's still the binary. We'd like to avoid that. But
obviously these things are not feminine. They're human, but it's just, we've coded them as feminine.
That was a super interesting thing about that therapy house that you visited. I forget where it was again. Utah? In Utah?
Yes, in Utah, yeah.
And this place where the guy talks about how it's this place to relearn masculinity and be masculine. But when you went and visited all of these young men and visited with him, you found, well, tell us about what you found, because it was super interesting.
So it was a really fascinating experience. So I came across this guy, his name is Cade Jones, and he runs this center for, it started off as just for boys. They now accept girls as well. But at that time, he was just accepting boys, and it was all boys and young men. And it was, for boys who were in trouble, they weren't, that they had substance abuse problems, or they had behavioral problems or emotional problems. And it was like a residential therapy center in Utah. And when I talked to Cade on the phone, I was saying, well, what do you see as being the major problem with young men at the moment, and why are boys struggling? And he was very much on the side of, it's a crisis of masculinity. We need to get back to traditional masculine values. We need to toughen them up. They need to be more masculine. So, and this is like a very common perception. So it's something that a lot of people in America think at the moment. So he said that I could come and stay there for a while and, be part of their groups. He was very generous. I went and stayed for several days at this place. And what I found was and this place was actually really helping these people. Everyone, without exception, all the boys and young men that I spoke to there were saying, this is great. This is so good to be here. But what they were actually doing was kind of the opposite of what he'd advertised it as. I expected it to be these like 30-mile runs and like, brutal kind of.
Like a boot camp or something.
Yeah, exactly. A kind of boot camp, army style, something or other. But what he was really offering were all these support groups and chances to talk and community and connection and empathy and hearing their feelings. And the boys were really responding to this. They were, they loved it. And, a lot of these boys were very lonely. They were very troubled. They had no one to turn to. They were saying, that they'd been hiding their so-called weaknesses for so long that they were just it was so corrosive to them that they were pretending to be okay, pretending to be strong and tough and masculine. And then they could come to this place and go to group therapy and go to individual therapy and talk to the other guys. And it had this sort of almost like this sort of slumber party vibe to it. They were all hanging out in the kitchen and talking about their feelings. And it was lovely, but it wasn't what I would traditionally associate with masculinity at all.
That is so interesting. And it sounds like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like Cade wasn't aware that that's what he was doing. Exactly. Like he knew what he was doing, but he wasn't aware that it wasn't like the traditional masculinity thing.
Yeah. I mean, it was funny because when I asked him, like, well, what is your definition of masculinity? He'd say something like, well, it's about relationship building and empathy and forming connections. And I'd be like, well, that's not what my thing. And I think what he was trying to do almost was to use the masculinity as a way to draw boys in, to use the sort of heading of positive masculinity or healthy masculinity as a way to sort of make it okay for boys to embrace those things. I have to say I've seen that a lot with various groups, the positive masculinity discussion. And I think these groups are generally doing good work. And I know that Cade is. It's not my favorite framing for that conversation.
No,
I feel like it reinforces the stereotypes. It's almost like saying, if we just have to fold everything into the definition of masculinity, you're really sending this clear message to boys that masculinity itself is non-negotiable. It has to be masculine. That's the starting point, and then everything else, And
well, I guess that's how they get people in. Even if the organizer himself isn't really aware of what he's doing, I guess we need to start talking more about humanity, right?
Yes.
Instead of masculinity or femininity. But he probably wouldn't have gotten all those boys if he said, come and discover your humanity.
Yes, it's so true. And he's in a very conservative community. Masculinity is something which is a value that's very important in that community. And so you're right, it is kind of a way to draw people in. And it's, I feel sort of churlish complaining about that because, he's doing great work and, it's not my own personal preferred framing for this conversation, but you got to start somewhere as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's sort of exemplary of the problem that boys are facing, right? Is that there is this limited definition of masculinity and that it's hard to get outside of that. Even he's finding that.
It's really hard. And it's sort of like, why does it have to be masculinity at all? I mean, in the book I talk about, you can't imagine that somebody running a program for girls calling it positive femininity or healthy femininity, because you realize that word comes with a lot of oppressive baggage. It sounds sort of laughable almost to be like, what's the future of femininity when you're talking about women's issues, because obviously that's kind of setting the terms already in a quite limited way of, the ways that women can be. And so, but I think we have this blind spot when it comes to masculinity. We kind of just can't conceive of a vision of boyhood or maleness outside of it.
Yeah. Well, you talk about that as a mother, that you were very aware of sexist things in like books and games and toys if they were sexist toward girls. But once you started seeing the sort of sexist toys towards boys stuff, you said that all flies under the radar when it's against boys.
So, yeah, that was so true. I mean, so I grew up with a feminist mom. My mom was a second wave feminist of the real like 70s and 80s, no Barbies, no nail polish, no pink, and she really like developed those like little sensors in us. We were those little mini feminist detectives, my sister and I. And so we'd be like, that's sexist and that's sexist. But I think now most girls have a sense of that. They'll see a stereotype in a book and they'll be like, they'll call it out and they'll be like, well, that's sexist. And I think that's great that girls have these tools. And, there's been a very, wide ranging and very detailed conversation about that. But yeah, for boys, it's just invisible. And it was invisible to me until I had my third son. I think I had two boys already. And boy stuff was just kind of default. It wasn't even gendered. It was just, so it's like very obvious by its absence. I started looking for examples of books which were about friendship and, not just that had friends in them incidentally, but that the narrative was driven by the relationship and the friendship and, figuring that side of things out. And I just couldn't see anything like that for boys at all. All my son's books, if we don't consciously correct for it, everything they have is about adventure or fighting or battles or competition. And there's always a hero, there's always a villain, there's always a winner, there's always a loser. There's none of that like complex relational negotiation. And I tell this story in the book, and it was such a turning point for me. I remember being in the bookstore with my sons, and there was this magazine on the shelf, and it had this like sparkly pink cover, and it's so clearly communicating this is a magazine for girls, you know. And it sort of had like a friendship bracelet giveaway on the cover. And then I opened it up, and there was a story in the magazine, and it was about this girl. She'd been invited, you know, she was like 9 or 10. She'd been invited to 2 birthday parties that were supposed to be happening at the same time. And she didn't want to let down either of the friends or disappoint them. So she had this whole like plan that she was going to go to one party and do the games, and then like secretly run off to the other girl's house and go to her party. And, you know, but the whole story was driven by this idea that it was her responsibility to manage the feelings of these 2 friends. And that was the thing driving the narrative. And she didn't want to disappoint them. And so this is how she responded. And she kind of exhausted herself in the process, and she collapsed at the end, I think. And I think I just was like, my boys will never read a story like this. There will never be a story where there are 2, you know, there's a boy who's desperately worried that he's going to disappoint one of his friends and not go to their birthday party. And I was like, for me, growing up as a girl, it was a real bog standard story that, you know, that would come into my life. I would have probably read, you know, hundreds like it. And my sons, you know, just have no access to that kind of modeling.
Or if it was, I'm thinking about some children's literature, and boy deep relationships were either with a girl, like Bridge to Terabithia, or with a dog.
Yes, exactly, with an animal. I mean, yeah, Niobe Way, who does great work in this area, said that she's an academic at NYU, and she specializes in boys' friendships. And she said she went to the library once to look for a book about boys' friendships, and every book that involved friendships was about being friends with an animal. There was just nothing that was about 2 boys having that kind of relationship with each other. And I think there are starting to be a few like that, but they're very few and far between. It's just not the model that boys see. And so, you know, and I think we've done such great work in kind of correcting for girl role models, you know. So now that you go to the bookstore, and there's hundreds of books about teaching your girl to be strong and mighty and be a CEO and be the, you know, a Supreme Court judge and being the, you know, the president or a superhero, but you don't see the correction the other way.
I think that's still because there's so much misogyny in our culture that it's okay for girls to be like boys, but it's not okay for boys to be like girls. Unless you're gay. And I read that in one of your interviews. One of the kids said, I wrote it down. One boy said, it's okay to be gay, but not gayish.
Yeah, so there's been all this progress in terms of actual literal homophobia, in the sense of most of the guys I spoke to said, yeah, it's okay to like guys, but you can't act like a girl. You can't
like if you're straight, you still have to be masculine. If you're actually gay.
But even if you're gay, it wasn't just for straight boys. It was like, even if you're gay, you can't act gay. You can like guys, you can have sex with guys, that's fine, but don't act like a girl. So that makes me think that the sort of underlying problem is actually misogyny rather than homophobia.
Well, let's switch gears just a little bit. You talked about screen time. Can you explain what displacement is?
Yeah, so displacement. So when researchers do studies or research into the kind of harms of screen time, there's like 2 areas that they look at. One of them is called content, which is basically like what you're literally seeing on when you go to your screen is harmful to you. So that would be like when you're scrolling Instagram and you see all your friends' like perfect lives, you feel terrible about your life. But the other major harm is this thing called displacement, which is that when you are on your screen, it means that you're not doing something else that is better or more healthy for you. And, you know, that could be sleeping or exercising. But the main thing that's being displaced by all this screen time is socializing in person. And the thing that is kind of been missing from this discussion is the displacement phenomenon has been much, much more significant for boys than for girls. So boys have more screen time. They have about 7 hours more screen time than girls in general, mostly playing video games. And they're socializing much less than girls in person, teenage boys. So the average girl was socializing, I think, around 6 hours a week. And the average boy, it was something like 42 minutes.
In person.
in person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that boys have these like parasocial relationships where they are on video games, these big multiplayer video games, and they're like on their headsets. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that, but when it takes the place of real life socializing, then some real problems emerge. And, I spent some time at the Teen Therapy Center down in LA, which is, and they run a guys group. So it's like teenage boys go for therapy. And the guy who runs it, Kent Toussaint, who's wonderful, says that every year he sees this sort of decline in boys' social skills. They're so used to having screens as a crutch for when they get together, or for interacting through this medium of the computer or a video game or Discord or something, that their actual real life social skills are kind of declining. And because we're not teaching them the relations, they're already starting off at a disadvantage. Like, boy socialization is so geared away from connection and intimacy and social skills that when you add in the screens, it just compounds the problem. And I see it with my own sons. It's a real battle. Like, when their friends come over, they just want to be on screens. And we have to really fight the tide to say, you have to find something to do in person. And often they just really don't know what to do with themselves. They're just kind of wandering around. And my kids are neurodivergent, but their friends are not. And I'm seeing this with all their friends as well.
Yeah, I hear that from a lot of parents that I work with. And I do hear parents saying, well, they say that they have to have the screen time because their friends are online.
Yeah.
But what I'm reading in your book, what I read in your book, is all these boys who do have lots of social screen time, but they still talk about being really lonely.
Yes.
And that makes so much sense to me. Also thinking of, like, in the context of COVID, like, we all had, like, when we were all in lockdown and, only had our bubbles, I think most of us as adults could say, yeah, it was a really lonely time, even though we had unlimited access to talking to our friends on Zoom, right?
So there's this sort of narrative that, that's just a different way to connect, that's just what they want. But when I started talking to these boys, they were like, no, we're lonely. And now, and a lot of them were like, I want to see my friends in person, but nobody's meeting up anymore. They're just like, the whole culture of socializing had changed. There were no parties, there were no like meetups, there were no hangouts, and I think when I was a teenager, there was just this culture of just kind of hanging out, and it wasn't like you had to like plan it or call, a little bit, but there would be places where people would just go, and it was very easy to access. And now these boys felt like it was so many steps to get to the point where they would be hanging out with somebody that it was just a barrier that they couldn't cross.
And I think that's happening with teenagers in general. Like, there's less hanging out with teenagers today.
And there's a ton of data to support that. I mean, there's like so much research that kids are hanging out so much less than kids of any previous generation since they started tracking this stuff. So
I guess when we were teenagers, we didn't have as much of a choice of, like, we had to connect in person more.
Yes.
So what can parents do? Do you have any ideas for how parents can help their kids, or sons especially, get over this screen-based socializing?
I mean, it's really hard. I think where I landed, and, look, I have had all this, I'm not approaching this from this high and mighty place and being like, oh yes, I know the answer to this. And it's just something I've thought about a lot, and I've seen enough data and done enough interviews to be worried about it. And I think the way that I ended up approaching it was, rather than seeing it as limiting screen time, to see it as sort of increasing in-person connection time. So really trying and sort of talking to other parents as much as I can to sort of set limits between us and say, look, when they see each other, just really trying to make time for them to meet up in person. And when they do, to sort of limit access to screens. And it can involve some like incredibly uncomfortable and excruciating times. Like, kids will come over for play dates and it'll be like, can we be on the screen? Can we be on the screen? Can we be on the screen? And I'm just feeling so terrible, and I want to help my kids. And I've been trying really hard to sort of overcome those uncomfortable feelings in myself to push through to the other side, because eventually they do actually find ways to connect. And I've seen it happen over and over again, but you have to really get through. And I feel like the feelings are as uncomfortable in me as they are in the kids,
I always try to tell parents, like, find some other parents who will be on the same page as you. And then it won't be, well, everyone else is on whatever the games are that they're playing.
Yeah. And I think it's fine for them to be on those games. It's not that I don't think that the games in themselves are so harmful. It's just like what they replace. So I think that, and I think, with my sons, it's sort of, worked well to kind of honor their love of those games, to not just be like, this is terrible and you should be doing, it's like they love that. That's important to them. Great, you can have it. But also, you also need to do this. And this
Totally. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with games. It's just when you spend too much time doing them, that what they prevent you from doing. And that's why I asked you about displacement, because I think that's a really
Yeah.
interesting way
Yeah,
to
right,
think about it.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's the thing. So I try to sort of see it as that. And the other thing that I would say about screens is just like when my kids were really little, there's this whole messaging around don't use screens as childcare. And I'm like, well, give me some childcare then. Provide if you the APA don't want me to use screens as childcare, then please support universal childcare, affordable childcare. And in the meantime, this is the best use of screens. I feel like screens are childcare, and we should feel fine about using them as that, because we have no social supports as parents. We have no federal childcare system. Childcare is so unaffordable. That's exactly what I want to use them for. And
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah,
that's
they're
okay.
so necessary sometimes, and parents wouldn't have been able to work during the pandemic if it hadn't been for screen time.
Absolutely. And, with, I'm obviously raising 3 neurodivergent kids, and they're very, very challenging, and I need the break, and I think that's okay. And I've tried to stop beating myself up about it and to try to add things in rather than forbid things. If I
Mm-hmm.
think always
Yeah,
works better for me.
that's a great approach. Can we talk about the incel paradox?
Yes.
That was one
Yeah.
of the most fascinating parts of your book.
Yeah. So I spent some time in the whole incel world. I don't know how much your listeners know about the incel movement, but it's this, incel stands for involuntary celibates. And it's often these like quite young men who are online. They're super lonely. They feel like they want to have sex with women or have relationships with women, and they can't. And they sort of form these communities online, which can be extremely misogynistic, extremely toxic, extremely violent, and horrifying. And at their worst, people associated with the incel movement have committed various like horrific crimes, mass murders, school shootings, this sort of stereotype of this like angry, lonely boy who goes and shoots a bunch of people out of resentment and hate. Often those guys are in some way involved in incel communities. And I was really kind of fascinated by this movement, because like fascinated in a horrified and terrified way. As the mother of 3 sons, I was like, these are boys who it felt like this was the sort of very extreme version of some sort of more mainstream trends. And I wanted to find out, there's this whole idea amongst lots of journalists that we should never engage with these people, because it's kind of this idea of empathy, that if we talk to them or humanize them in any way, then we're kind of somehow condoning this like violent misogyny or, mass murder. But I was really keen to sort of hear from these people directly, to really talk to these guys, because I was like, look, obviously we can all agree that this thing is wrong, that like mass murder and terrible racism and misogyny and all the rest of it is wrong. But like, what is going on for these people? What are the trends that are driving this? So I spent a lot of time on incel message boards, and I did in-depth interviews with a handful of incels, a couple of which I featured in the book. And what really struck me was that the things that they were saying, I sort of half expected them to be these kind of very extreme freaks, but actually a lot of the things they were saying were very uncomfortably close to what a lot of the sort of more regular quote unquote kids had been telling me as well. These feelings of loneliness, these feelings of disconnection, these feelings of these impossible pressures to be masculine and tough and to meet this ideal of masculinity that they always felt they were falling short. These ideas of being shut down by the wider conversation about, in the culture wars about men and boys and privilege. And these were guys who just really didn't feel privileged at all. They felt very powerless in their own lives. And I actually ended up having some really productive and deep conversations with these guys that I felt, that they were very extreme, but they were kind of almost like the logical conclusion, like the most scary conclusion of a lot of sort of mainstream threads in boy culture at the moment, which is frightening.
Yeah, and you talked about how ironically, the incel community had gotten the closest to getting rid of the toxic masculinity norms of any community that you talk to. Can you
Yeah,
say a
in
little
some
bit
ways.
more
In
about
some
that?
ways, so it was really interesting because in some ways it was sort of the opposite of that, because on Incel message boards, you see these like horrifying things. You can go on the front page and just see the most repulsive, misogynistic, angry, toxic, horrible, horrible postings. But what you also see is this kind of real tender brotherhood, these guys. So what the incels, their sort of self-conception is that they are like the losers in the system of masculinity, that they see it as this hierarchy. They have these guys that they call chads, who are the like successful men who are like tall and handsome and powerful, and they get all the women, and so there are those guys, and then there's sort of the beta males below them, and then the incels are like right at the bottom of this hierarchy of masculinity in their worldview. They're short, they're overweight, girls don't want them, that they feel very emasculated, and it's almost like they've given up hope of ever being anything else, of ever succeeding in that system of masculinity. So they've just like thrown off the pressures altogether, and so then they feel able. And so these incel guys that I spoke to were saying, look, this is the only place I can really be myself. This is the only place I can be vulnerable. I get all this support from my incel brothers. I find this real connection. We're emotional with each other. We're not trying to prove anything. They've basically taken themselves out of the system. And that was like, in a way, like very touching, in a very twisted and horrible way. It was very touching, but it was also very scary because you can see that if boys don't find connection and emotional vulnerability and the chance to be themselves elsewhere, they will find it in the manosphere, in these awful toxic spaces. And, that's something that we really have to be aware of. We really need to provide this for boys somewhere else if you don't want them to be looking for it there.
Yeah, it was so wild to read about that it's sort of like everything got broken down, and what was left, I mean, when you not that you can put aside all of the violence and the misogyny, but if you did put aside the violence and misogyny, you would have like the humanity that is lacking in the traditional masculinity.
Absolutely. And I think what we're missing in the discussion of it is, so there's this real push at the moment to label these guys as terrorists, and there's this argument that, we need to show consistency. And like, if sort of an Arab Muslim commits an act of mass murder, we label him a terrorist straight away. But if it's a white guy, we say he has mental health problems, and like the media discourse will be about that. And I'm like, so, we should call these guys terrorists to be kind of consistent and for justice. And I'm like, well, actually, I'd rather see it go in the other direction, that we give the mental health support to the Arab Muslim guy as well, and to the white guy, not that all incels are white. I was surprised that actually it was really a pretty diverse community in terms of race. But, I'd rather that we humanize everybody and give all these guys support, rather than trying to go to the lowest common denominator and condemn everybody, which is not to say that we should not condemn violence of all kinds. Of course, that goes without saying. But these guys were often desperate for support. They desperately wanted therapy. They desperately wanted mental health help, but they felt they couldn't access it, partly because if they went to a therapist and said, I'm an incel, she'd be like, well, you're a terrorist, get out of my office. That was their perception. And they felt that, the conversation around male pain and male emotions, that they were constantly being shut down from both sides, from the guys on the right being like, man up, shut up, squash your emotions, and from the guys or the people on the left being like, well, don't speak about your pain because it's taking
male tears.
Male tears, exactly. Like, shut up, men, you're privileged, time for somebody else to have a chance, and let women speak, or let somebody else speak.
Well, just to sort of wrap it up here, I love in the end of the book you talk about sweetheart versus buddy.
Oh, yeah.
Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
And I love how you said at the end that we should treat our boys like sweethearts.
I mean, we were talking before about like how these things are so invisible in our culture, the sort of sexist against boys thing, they just fly under the radar. And it was my son's first day at kindergarten, and there was this guy, I don't actually know if he was a teacher or a volunteer or something, but this man, he was at the gate and he was greeting all the kids as they walked in, and like there were a couple girls in front of my son, and he was like, hi sweetheart, and then Abe, my youngest, walks in and he's like, hi buddy, and like high fives him. And it was like, he's in kindergarten. He's already tracked into this like buddy system. And, it was sweet. It was so well-meaning. It was so harmless on the face of it. It's such, it's not really a big deal. But like, he's already seeing the girls as these like creatures that are in need of nurture and protection. And the boy is this almost like this sort of drinking peer, this like buddy. And like buddy, it's like sort of a tick away from a fight. It's like, hi buddy is kind of a bit like, hey buddy, that it's just like this, it's this sort of performance of masculinity. And it's so subtle, but you see it all the time. I mean, my middle son, I remember the labor and delivery nurse calling him buddy, like literally as she's cleaning the gunk off his body as soon as he's born. And it is just that we track boys and girls into these different systems, and we can see where girls lose out in it. I say in the book, buddy, the buddies are in the locker room making all the important decisions, and, that sort of marginalizes girls. But also, boys are excluded from intimacy and connection and nurture. And I feel like young boys, we need to start seeing them as vulnerable and, yes, seeing them as sweethearts, not just buddies.
I was thinking about this study that I heard about a couple of months ago that talked about the political views of Gen Z.
Gen Z,
And it occurred to me that men and boys could see Me Too and the sort of the lifting up of women and girls as taking something away from them, right? Taking away their power, taking away their privilege, and
yes.
they're not getting anything back in return, right? They're just like, quote, losing.
Yes,
and, I think, I mean, this is like super overly simplistic, and I don't know how we do this, but like what they need to be given is that sweetheart, right? Like the humanity piece and the like love and nurturing and connection.
Yes.
So they don't feel like they're left with nothing.
Yes. I think that the left has done a bad job of articulating this to boys, because smashing these systems of patriarchy, we see it as this, like all the girls are chanting it and it's in the Barbie movie and smash the patriarchy. And you can see why this message isn't connecting with boys, because they're not visible in it. Patriarchy harms boys and men. It makes them, it squashes their feelings, it squashes their emotions, it squashes their access to intimacy and connection, but that's not visible to them. And I feel like the feminist movement and the left has done a bad job of articulating that boys can also benefit from the ends of these rigid stereotypes and roles. Boys can benefit from that. But I think as long as we adopt this tone of like mockery or ridicule, or you're so privileged, or you're so powerful, or shut up, or, they will never connect with that message. You've got to give people something, you're right, something positive, something hopeful, something that feels like a benefit to them rather than just a loss. And I think the feminist left has to, of which I consider myself a part, has to do a better job of communicating that to boys.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've done
everybody, not just the feminist left, everybody.
Yeah.
We've got to get rid of these stereotypes and systems that oppress boys, and keep them locked in a box.
You've done a really good job of getting us partway there with your book, and also how you're raising your boys. Well, thanks for coming on. I have a question that I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your new parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Such a great question. Well, I think there's a lot of things. I think respond with more nurture rather than less. I think, don't be so hard on myself. I think, I saw everything as my fault. And I think, I think that was harmful for me, and it didn't help the boys. So I think maybe more nurture for them and more nurture for myself, probably.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
And we'll link to your book in the show notes, and I encourage everybody to grab a copy of it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.